The order to kneel arrived before the choir's flagship had even finished slowing down. It came as sound first, then as light, then as a pressure behind the eyes that no instrument on Brightwater Station was built to measure. Junior Signal Officer Daniel Crew felt it as a soft, certain voice that seemed to rise out of his own thoughts, and the voice was telling him that surrender was a thing he had decided long ago. He was 26 years old, and he had been awake for 19 hours, and he did not kneel. "Talk to me," Captain Mara Voss said from the command rail behind him. She was 51, gray at the temples, and her voice was flat in the way of people who had learned long ago that panic was a luxury for crews who had time to spare. "What is that? Crew, what am I listening to?" "It's not a transmission, ma'am," Daniel said. His own voice sounded far away to him. "Not exactly. It's coming in across 40 bands at once, and they're all carrying the same thing. It's a song. A song. A song that wants something." He swallowed. His hands were steady on the console, which surprised him, because the rest of him was not. "It wants us to stop." Brightwater was a relay station, nothing more. A ring of gray steel hanging in slow orbit above a dead moon at the dark edge of the Velmar system. It held a crew of 41. It had no weapons larger than a hull cutter rated for clearing ice, because that was the law, and humanity had kept the law for 103 years. The station's whole purpose was to listen and to pass messages along, and now it was listening to the largest thing any human being had ever seen. The choir armada had come out of the dark without a flare of warning. One moment the long-range plates showed empty sky. The next, they showed hulls. Not a dozen, not 100. "Give me the count," Voss said. Daniel ran it twice, because the first number could not be right, and the second number was the same as the first. 19,400 contacts, he said. "Confirmed. They're holding a sphere formation around the lead ship." Nobody on the command deck spoke. The only sound was the soft tone of the long-range array and, under it, almost too faint to name, the song. The lead ship was the one the human catalogs had a name for, though no human had ever seen it this close. The choir called it the hymn. It was a cathedral ship, and the word was not poetry. It was 112 kilometers long from its blunt prow to the great folded structures at its stern, and it was shaped like something built to be looked up at and worshipped. Spires rose from its hull in ordered rows. Light moved through it in slow tides, the way light moves through stained glass when something walks behind the window. It was beautiful, and it was the most frightening thing Daniel had ever looked at, and those two facts did not cancel. They added. "They're hailing," Daniel said. "All of them, at once. Put it on, audio only. I don't want that light on my deck." He routed it through, and the command deck filled with the choir's voice. It did not sound like 19,400 ships. It sounded like one voice, vast and patient and kind, a chorus folded down into a single throat. And the terrible thing about it was that it did not threaten. It reassured. It told them, in words that arrived already inside their heads, that the fighting was over now, that it had always been over, that the wise thing and the safe thing, and the thing they had truly wanted all along, was to lay down and be still, and let the song carry them. It told them that this was their own idea. It told them they were choosing it freely. "That," Voss said quietly, "is the ugliest thing I've ever heard." A young technician, 2 stations down, a woman named Okafor, had her hands pressed flat against her own ears. "Captain, it's in the comms. It's in the lights. It's in the deck plating. I can feel it in my teeth," she said. "How do we shut it out?" "You don't shut it out," Voss said. "You decide it's wrong, and you keep deciding that. Every second. That's all. That's the whole trick." She came down off the rail and walked the length of the deck, slow, deliberate, letting them see her not kneel. "Listen to me, all of you. That song has worked on better fleets than ours. We know the history, so you are going to hear it tell you that you already gave up, and you are going to look it in the eye and say no, out loud if you have to. I do not care how stupid it feels." "No," said Okafor, very quietly, like a person testing a word in a new language. Louder. "No." It was working, in the way that small things work against large ones. The song pressed, and the crew of Brightwater pressed back, 41 human beings deciding, one heartbeat at a time, that they had not surrendered, and would not. And the strangeness of it was that the deciding seemed to make the song uncertain. The chorus faltered for half a second, the way a single singer falters when one voice in the hall refuses to follow. Then it gathered itself and sang harder. Daniel watched the bands on his board flex as the song redoubled. 40 channels, all carrying the same will, all pushing at once. He had trained for jamming. He had trained for hostile broadcast, and for false orders, and for a dozen kinds of attack that came down a wire. He had never trained for this, because no one had told him it could be trained for, because the official position of 9 galactic powers was that the Neil song could not be resisted at all. Every species that had ever heard it had folded. That was a fact written into the survival guides, into the treaties, into the long, careful peace. You did not fight the choir. You could not. When the choir sang, you knelt, and you were grateful, and you called it your own choice for the rest of your shortened history. Except that the crew of Brightwater was not kneeling. Daniel could feel the song reaching for him, finding the small, tired part of him that had been awake for 19 hours and would have liked, very much, to simply stop. And he could feel himself refusing it, not with any great courage, but with a flat, stubborn irritation, the same feeling he got when someone told him a thing was impossible that he had already half decided to do anyway. It's getting frustrated, he said. The song. I can see it in the bands. It keeps changing its shape, like it's looking for a way in that it can't find. Good, Voss said. Frustrate it more. Daniel had spent 8 months on Brightwater believing he understood the place. It was a quiet posting, the kind given to junior officers who had done nothing wrong, and nothing remarkable. A ring of steel at the edge of nowhere, whose busiest day involved rerouting a trade convoy around a debris field. He had logged the moon as a gravity anchor 100 times, without once thinking about it. He had passed the inspection records through the relay without once reading them. He had assumed, the way young people assume, that the world was exactly as plain as it looked, and that the great events of history happened to other people in other systems. Now 19,400 warships were singing his crew to sleep, and the captain was talking about 103 years, as if she had lived through all of it, and the dead moon below them was waking up, and Daniel understood that the quiet posting had never been quiet at all. It had only been waiting. Brightwater had been built for exactly one morning, and this was that morning, and he happened to be the one sitting at the board when it came. How many of us know, he asked, on the station, about the moon? Before today? Me. Voss did not take her eyes off the screen. Now? All 41 of you, in about 2 minutes, whether I want it or not. The secret was only ever worth keeping until the day it had to be spent. Today's the day we spend it. She glanced at him. Stay at your board, crew. The choir is the easy part now. The hard part is what we do after, when the galaxy starts asking how a dead rock learned to say no. The choir had a name for the form that spoke for it in matters like this. It was a coordinator, a single mind grown to hold and shape the will of the whole, and the catalogs called it the Velmar note, because this region of space was where it had first been heard. When the Velmar note spoke now, the words changed. They were no longer only reassurance. They carried a tone of polite confusion, the confusion of a teacher whose lesson is not landing. You are not joining, said the Velmar note, through 19,400 hulls. All who hear, join. You hear. Why are you not joining? Because we're busy, Voss said, though her words went nowhere, because the choir did not listen the way a person listens. Crew. Anything from below. Below was the moon. It was a gray, cratered, unremarkable moon named Harrow, and it had hung under Brightwater for as long as the station had existed. The official records described it as a slag body, a dead lump of rock, and metal too poor in ore to mine, and too dull to study, useful only as a gravity anchor for the relay. That was what the records said. That was what the 9 galactic powers believed, because that was what humanity had spent a great deal of effort and a great deal of patience making them believe. Daniel's board, which a moment ago had shown the moon as a flat gray nothing, was no longer flat. Ma'am, he said, and his voice cracked, and he did not care. Harrow is moving. Define moving. Internal. He stared at the readout, and a cold thread went up his spine that had nothing to do with the song. There's structure down there. Under the crust. I'm reading mass shifts. Heat blooming along lines. Hundreds of kilometers of lines, straight lines. Ma'am, nothing makes straight lines that long by accident. Power is coming up across the whole body. He looked at the number and felt the floor of the world tilt under him. It's coming up everywhere at once. Voss did not look surprised. That was the thing Daniel would remember later, when he had time to remember anything. She did not look surprised at all. "How long have you been on Brightwater, crew?" she asked. 8 months, ma'am. "Then there's a thing you don't know yet, and you're about to know it whether I tell you or not, so I'll tell you." She put her hand on the back of his chair and looked down at the moon on his screen, the dead gray moon that had stopped being dead. "We did keep the law, every word of it. We never built a warship bigger than a customs cutter. That's true. The galaxy made us promise, and we promised, and we never broke it." The song surged again, and somewhere on the deck, a man began, quietly, to weep, and kept working anyway. "But the law said we couldn't build a ship," Voss said. "It never said one word about a moon." On the screen, a seam of white light opened across the gray face of Harrow, ruler straight, 1,400 kilometers long, and began, very slowly, to widen. Daniel Crew looked at it. Then he looked at the 19,400 hulls hanging above it, singing their patient song about surrender, certain that they had already won. "They don't know," he said. The understanding came up through him like cold water. "They came here to make us kneel, and they parked their whole armada right on top of it, and they don't know what they're sitting on." "No," Voss said, "they don't." She straightened. She keyed the station-wide channel, the one that reached every deck and every corridor and every frightened person aboard Brightwater, and when she spoke her voice was steady and almost gentle, the voice of a woman delivering news she had carried a long time. "All hands, this is the captain. In about 3 minutes, you are going to see something that no living human outside of one room has ever seen, and that the rest of the galaxy spent the last century being very carefully told does not exist." She paused. The song pressed against the hull, against the lights, against the teeth of every soul aboard. "Hold the line in your own head. Do not kneel. Whatever that thing out there tells you that you decided, you did not decide it. You decided this." She looked at the widening line of light on the moon below. "Wake him up," she said. "Tell Admiral Holt the choir came to the right system. Tell him they brought 19,400 reasons, and Harrow is awake." Far beneath the gray crust, in a room that had waited 103 years for exactly this morning, something enormous drew its first full breath. And the song, for the first time in 10,000 years of singing, hit a voice it could not bend, and did not understand why. Admiral Holt woke the way a mountain might wake, slowly and without complaint, in a room buried 400 kilometers under the gray crust of Harrow. He was 70 years old. He had been in that room, on and off, longer than most of the crew of Brightwater had been alive. When the chime sounded, and the lights came up along the long curve of the command gallery, he did not startle. He simply opened his eyes, looked at the readout that told him the choir had finally arrived, and said, to the empty air, "Took you long enough." The gallery around him was not the bridge of a station. It was the bridge of something else entirely. And from where Holt stood, he could see down the length of a chamber so large that the far end was lost in haze, lined with stations and screens, and the slow amber lights of systems coming up out of a sleep that had lasted 100 years. 3,000 people lived and worked down here, in the deep parts of the moon, and they were waking up too, deck by deck, all along the length of the hidden ship. Because that was what Harrow was, not a moon with a ship inside it, a ship wearing a moon as a coat. "Status," Holt said, and a deck officer named Idris, who had been born in these tunnels, answered without looking up. "Spine is at 60% and climbing, sir. Crust seems responding. We have full contact with Brightwater. Captain Voss reports the song is active, and her crew is holding." A pause. "She also reports 19,400 hulls, sir. Confirmed twice." Holt nodded slowly. "Of course they brought everything. Why wouldn't they? They've never lost." He folded his hands behind his back. "Bring the spine up the rest of the way. Quietly. I don't want 1 watt leaking through the crust until I say so. Let them keep singing." He walked the gallery while the numbers climbed, the way he had walked it 10,000 times in 100 drills, and for the first time the walk meant something. The screens that had only ever shown test patterns now showed an enemy. The stations that had only ever run rehearsals now ran live. He stopped at the great chart of the system and looked at the tidy sphere of the choir's formation, 19,400 hulls, arranged with the calm confidence of a thing that had never once needed a second plan, and he felt no fear. He had used up all his fear decades ago, lying awake in the dark wondering if the moon would ever be needed, and worse, wondering if it would work. The fear was gone now. There was only the long, cold patience that had been bred into everyone who served down here, and under it, very quiet, a grief he would not look at directly, for the people who had built this, and not live to see it stand. Up on Brightwater, Daniel Crew could not hear any of this. He could only watch the moon below him change, and listen to Voss tell him, in the long minutes while the seam of light widened, the story that the rest of the galaxy had been so carefully kept from. "You learned the Reach War in school," she said. "Everyone did. You learned the part where we won, and then you learned the part where winning didn't matter." He had. Every human child did. The Reach War had been the moment humanity stopped being a curiosity at the edge of the galactic map and became a problem. 9 powers, ancient and proud, had been fighting over the Reach worlds for 200 years when humanity arrived in the middle of it, young and loud and impossibly stubborn, and refused to die on schedule. Humans had taken losses that would have broken any of the older species and had simply kept coming back, building faster than they could be destroyed, holding ground that all the math said could not be held. By the end of it, humanity had not conquered anyone. Humanity had simply made itself impossible to remove. And that had frightened the 9 powers more than any conquest. "So they didn't beat us," Voss said. "They couldn't. They did something smarter. They sat us down at a table, and they made a treaty, and the treaty was kind, on paper. It let us keep our worlds. It let us trade. It let us live." Her mouth twisted, and it said, in language 1,000 pages long, that humanity would never again build a warship larger than a customs cutter. Not one. Forever. With inspections. With penalties. With 9 separate fleets standing ready to come and finish the job if we ever cheated. "And we agreed," Daniel said. "We agreed. We signed it with both hands, and we meant it." Voss watched the seam of light. And the moment the ink dried, a few very quiet people asked a very quiet question. They asked, "What is a warship?" The seam on Harrow widened another 2 kilometers as he watched. "A warship is a thing you build," Voss said. "It has a hull and engines and a place to put weapons, and the treaty defined all of that, every centimeter of it, so the inspectors would know one when they saw one. The people who wrote the treaty were very thorough. They were so thorough that they left a hole you could fly a moon through. They defined a warship. They never once defined a moon." She almost smiled. "So we didn't build a warship. We took a moon that was already here, that the inspectors had already scanned and logged and dismissed as worthless slag. And over the next 103 years, very slowly, working only with material that was already inside it, we made it into something." "The inspections," Daniel said. "They came. I've read the logs. 9 inspections in 100 years, and every one of them signed off on Harrow as a dead rock." "They scanned the surface," Voss said. "Why would they scan deeper? It's slag. It's been slag for 1 billion years. Their own first survey said so, and a species that lives for 10,000 years trusts its own old records. They came, they looked at the gray crust, they checked it against the survey from before the war, and they saw exactly what they expected to see. We made very sure of that. Every gram we moved inward, where the crust would hide the heat. Every system we built cold, so it would read as rock until the day we needed it. 3 generations of people lived their whole lives down there in the dark, building a thing they would never see used, so that their grandchildren might." She was quiet for a moment, watching the line of light grow. "You want to know the part that nobody writes down," she said. "It wasn't built by an army. It was built by families. The first crews went down into Harrow as young men and women, and they never really came back up. They married down there. They had children down there. Those children grew up learning a trade with no name, a trade that existed only inside one moon, and was illegal to so much as describe, and they spent their lives making a weapon they had been told would almost certainly never fire. Do you understand what that asks of a person? To give your whole life to a thing, and to hope, genuinely hope, that the giving was wasted, that you would grow old and die, and the moon would stay a moon, and the secret would die with you, and no one would ever know the promise had been kept, because the keeping of it would never be needed. She shook her head slowly. And they did it. 103 years of people doing it. That's the thing the song is fighting, crew. It's not fighting 41 of us on a station. It's fighting all of them. Daniel thought about the inspections again. The 9 of them, spread across a century. He had passed their records through the relay, without reading them, but he had seen the dates. And now the dates meant something. The first inspection had come 4 years after the treaty, when the work inside Harrow could not have been more than a few corridors and a great deal of hope. The inspectors had brought a survey fleet and a battery of deep scanners, and the full suspicion of 9 powers who did not trust humanity an inch, and they had found a dead moon, because at that point it very nearly was one. The builders had learned from that first visit. They had learned exactly what the scanners looked for, and exactly how to hide it, and after that, every inspection found a little less than the one before, because the builders got better at concealment faster than the inspectors got better at seeing. The 4th inspection almost found it, Voss said, as if she had followed his thought. I've read the file. It's the only one that ever worried us. Their lead scanner picked up a thermal line, deep, 40 kilometers down, far longer than any natural fault. A straight line of heat. They flagged it. She let the moment sit. And then their own oldest survey, the one from before the war, said the region was geologically dead, and a species that lives 10,000 years does not argue with its own records over a single warm fault. So they wrote it up as a settling crack in the slag, and they went home. 40 kilometers of spine assembly, logged as a crack. She almost laughed, and there was no humor in it. We were that close. One stubborn scanner technician, on their side. And none of this happens. The galaxy never trusts itself enough. We were counting on that. We bet 100 years on it. The song surged through Brightwater again, and this time it changed its shape. The Velmar note had been patient. Now, slowly, the choir was growing puzzled, and a puzzled hive is a strange and unsettling thing, because its confusion arrived as a feeling in every human chest at once. A vast, cold bewilderment that did not belong to any of them. Why do you not lay down? The Velmar note asked, and for the first time, the kindness in it had thinned. Every species lays down. The song does not fail. The song has never failed. You hear it. You feel it. You know it is true. Lay down. It thinks it's broken, Okafor said softly from her station. Captain, listen to it. It doesn't think we're resisting. It thinks something's wrong with the song. It can't even imagine us saying no, so it's looking for the malfunction. She was right. And that was the thing the 9 powers had never understood about the choir, and the thing the choir had never understood about humanity. The Neil song did not conquer, it convinced. It reached into a species, and it found the small, reasonable voice that every thinking creature carries. The voice that says, perhaps it would be easier to stop, and it made that voice the only voice. It had worked on the proud, and the ancient, and the strong. It had folded the Dreven, who had ruled 40 systems. It had folded the Sahti, whose warriors had never retreated in 9,000 years. It worked, because every species it had ever met, in the moment of the song, had agreed somewhere deep down that surrender might be the wise thing. Humans did not agree. Not because they were braver, because they were worse at agreeing. The same stubbornness that had won the Reach War, the bloody-minded refusal to accept a settled fact, the deep, ungovernable conviction that no was always available, no matter what everyone else had decided, was the one thing the song could not work with. It needed a door. Humans had bricked theirs up a long time ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with the choir, and now the song stood outside it singing, and could not understand why no one answered. Daniel thought about the species the song had folded, the ones in the survival guides. The Dreven had been a great civilization once, 40 systems, 10,000 years of art and law and patience, and the choir had come and sung, and the Dreven had laid down their arms and walked, smiling, calling it peace, into a silence they never came out of. The guides did not say what happened to a folded species. No one knew. No one had ever come back to report. That was the part that should have frightened a sensible person most. the not knowing. And it was, Daniel realized, exactly the part the song could not use against a human, because a human looked at the not knowing and got stubborn about it instead of afraid. "Crew," Voss said, "talk to me about the swarm. What are they doing while their boss is confused?" Daniel pulled the formation up. "Holding the sphere, ma'am, but it's loosening. The outer hulls are drifting. They're not getting clean orders." He frowned. "It's like a choir, where the conductor stopped conducting. They've never had to act on their own. The whole point of them is that they don't act on their own." "Counts," Voss said. "Break them down for me." 19,400 total. The hymn at the center, the big one, the 112-kilometer ship. Around it, a layer of what the catalogs call processionals, about 400 of them, each one maybe 9 kilometers. Those are the strong ones. They carry the heavy projectors. He scrolled. Then the bulk. 18,996 lesser hulls, 1 to 3 kilometers each. Drones, mostly. Voices, the catalog calls them. They don't think. They just sing, and they just shoot. 18,996 things that just shoot, Voss said. And 41 of us on a station with one ice cutter. Yes, ma'am. Good thing we're not the ones fighting them. She looked down at the moon. How's the seam? The seam was no longer a seam. The 1,400-kilometer line of light had become a canyon, and a second line had opened to cross it, and a third, and the gray crust of Harrow was breaking into vast plates along edges that had been machined 100 years ago and waited in the dark for this single morning. Light poured up from between the plates, white and hard and absolutely steady, the light of systems that had never once been switched on, and were now all coming on at once and working perfectly the first time, because they had been built by people who knew they would only ever get one chance. Down in the deep gallery, Admiral Holt watched the same thing from the inside, watched the crust of his ship begin to peel back from the hull beneath it, and he felt something he had not let himself feel in a very long time. He had been a young officer when he first came down into Harrow. He had given the project his whole life on the understanding that it would almost certainly never be needed, that the best possible outcome was for him to grow old and die in the dark, and for the moon to stay a moon forever. A weapon so secret it was never fired. A promise kept so completely that no one ever learned it had been made. That had been the hope, a wasted life, in the only sense of waste that anyone down here would have been glad to accept. The choir had taken the hope away. They had come, all 19,400 of them, and parked themselves in a tidy sphere around the very moon, and begun to sing. "Sir," Idris said, "spine is at 90%. Crust plates are at 40% open. The choir is going to see structure in about 90 seconds, no matter how cold we keep it. There's too much of us coming out from under the rock." "Let them see," Holt said. "By the time they understand it, it won't matter." He walked forward to the great curved window at the front of the gallery, a window that had looked at nothing but solid rock for a century, and watched the rock split apart and the stars come through. "Get me Voss." A moment later, Mara Voss's voice came into the gallery, steady, dry, the voice of an old colleague. "Admiral, nice of you to join us. The neighbors are loud." "So I hear. How are your people?" "Holding. The song can't get a grip, just like the old man always said it wouldn't." A pause. "How long, Holt?" "Spine's almost up. I'll want a clean minute once the crust is fully open. Keep your 41 steady. When this thing fires, your station is going to think the sun came on early, and I'd rather your crew didn't panic and try to flee into 19,000 warships." "Understood. A beat." "Holt, they still don't know what they're looking at. The coordinator keeps asking us why the song won't take. It's not even scared. It's confused." "Good," Holt said. "Let it stay confused 30 seconds longer." He looked at the readout, at the spine climbing toward full, at the great line of light running the length of his hidden ship. "It came a very long way to teach us to kneel. The least we can do is finish the lesson it started." He paused. "There's a word loaded in the spine, Voss. Did you know that? The builders put it there 60 years ago. The weapon paints it along the hull as it fires. One word, 2 kilometers tall. They argued about it for a year, the records say. 40-some proposals. They picked the shortest one." "What did they pick?" "You'll see it," Holt said. "Same as the choir will. That's the point of it. On Brightwater, Daniel Crew watched the last plates of Harrow's crust grind open, and what lay beneath them stole the breath out of him, because it was not the underside of a moon. It was a hull. Polished, dark, kilometers deep, running away in both directions farther than the eye could follow, and down the center of it, glowing now with a light that hurt to look at, ran a single straight line that he understood. All at once, and with a kind of awe that was very close to fear, was the largest weapon ever built by human hands. The song faltered. For the first time, in the vast voice of the choir, Daniel heard something that was not confusion and was not patience. For the first time, the choir sounded afraid. "What is beneath?" the Velmar note said, and the chord of 19,400 voices cracked down the middle as it said it. "What is beneath the rock? The rock is moving. The rock is not rock. What have you been building? What have you been building under the song where we could not hear it? You really want to know?" Voss said quietly, to a thing that could not hear her, and would understand soon enough anyway. "You banned us from building a fleet." She watched the line of light on the hull below them burn toward full power. "So we built a moon instead." The opening of Harrow was not a thing that happened all at once. It was a thing that happened the way a continent moves, slow and unstoppable, and far too large for the eye to take in, and the crew of Brightwater watched it from the only seats in the galaxy that had a clear view. The last of the crust plates came free at 13 minutes past the hour. They did not fall away. They were too massive to fall, and there was nowhere to fall to. Instead, they swung outward on hidden hinges the size of cities, peeling back along the body of the moon like the petals of some vast gray flower, and as each one moved it revealed more of the thing it had been hiding for 103 years. "I'm trying to map it," Daniel said. His hands moved over the board without his quite telling them to. "The hull. I'm trying to get the dimensions, and the readout keeps refusing the number." "Why?" Voss asked. "Because the number's wrong. The number says the ship is the same size as the moon." He looked up. "Captain, it's not a ship inside the moon. The whole moon was the ship. All of it. There's nothing under the hull but more hull. They didn't build a vessel and bury it. They hollowed out a world and made it a weapon, and left the crust on for camouflage. Harrow was 1,800 kilometers across. That was the figure in every survey, the figure the inspectors had checked 9 times. 1,800 kilometers of dead gray rock. And every meter of it that was not crust was now revealed to be machine, dark and polished and threaded with light. An object so large that the human mind kept trying to file it as geography rather than engineering, because nothing built was supposed to be this big. "Look at the surface of the hull," Daniel said, half to himself. "There are markings. There's writing on it. Down near the spine. Lines and lines of it." He brought the image up larger, and the words resolved, and his throat tightened. "It's names. They wrote names on it. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. It's a list of names, running the whole length of the ship." "The builders," Voss said quietly. "Every one of them, 3 generations. They put their names on the inside of the crust, where no enemy would ever see them, where the only thing that would ever read them was the dark." She was silent for a moment. "Until today. The crust came off, and now the whole galaxy is going to read them, whether the galaxy wants to or not." Down in the deep gallery, Admiral Holt watched the stars pour in through the great window as the last plate cleared, and for one moment, before there was work to do, he let himself simply look. He had spent his life inside this thing in the dark. He had never once seen it from outside, and he never would, but he could see it now on the gallery screens as the choir's own sensors must be seeing it, and even to him, who knew every weld and every chamber, it was staggering. "Spine at 100%, Idris said quietly. "All sections report ready. Sir, we have never had every system green at the same time, not once in 100 years of tests. They're all green now." "They were built to be green now," Holt said. "Not before, now." He turned from the window. "Talk to me about the swarm." Before Idris could answer, a younger officer at the navigation station spoke up, a woman named Sable who had been born 2 decks below the gallery and had never once in her life stood under an open sky. "Sir," she said, with respect, "we have a clean firing solution on the whole formation right now. They're bunched. Why are we waiting?" It was a fair question, and Holt did not pretend otherwise. Because 3,000 of us are about to do a thing that 19,000 of them are about to learn is possible, he said. And I want it done in a way that can be told. There's a difference between killing a fleet and ending a story, Sable. We have one chance to do this in front of the whole galaxy. And the galaxy needs to understand exactly what it is watching, and why, and from where. So we wait the extra minute. We let them see the moon open. We let them understand, just a little, before the end, what was always under the rock they ignored. He looked at the chart. 103 years bought us the right to take an extra minute. We're going to spend it on being understood. Sable nodded slowly and turned back to her board, and around the gallery, a few of the older hands traded the smallest of glances, because they had served under Holt long enough to know that this was the closest the man ever came to a speech, and that he only made one when he believed it was the last he would ever need to. The swarm was coming apart. It had taken the choir 19 minutes to understand what it was looking at, and the understanding had moved through 19,400 hulls the way a crack moves through ice, and it had broken something. Up on Brightwater, Daniel Crew watched it happen on his board, and even through his fear, he found it hard to look away, because he was watching a single mind discover, for the first time in 10,000 years, that it had been wrong. The formation's gone, he reported. The sphere collapsed. They're scattering, ma'am. But it's not a plan. It's not a retreat. It's noise. The outer hulls are pulling back toward the hymn, and the inner hulls are pushing out, and they're colliding. They're running into each other. The conductor lost the beat, and the choir doesn't know how to sing alone. Because it never had to, Voss said. One mind, 19,000 bodies. Cut the mind in half with a single bad surprise, and every body tries to move at once, and none of them agree. She watched the chaos blooming on the screen. They built themselves to never be confused, Crew, so they never built a way to handle being confused. We built ourselves out of nothing but confusion. That's the whole difference. That's been the whole difference the entire time. Daniel watched two of the lesser hulls drift into one another and crumple. 3 kilometers of warship, folding against 3 kilometers of warship, neither of them fired upon, both of them simply lost without a hand to guide them. He had expected, somewhere in the back of his mind, that when the moment came, the great enemy would at least die fighting. He was learning that the choir did not know how to fight. It had never needed to learn. It had a song, and the song had always been enough. And a thing that is always won by one method has no second method to reach for when the first one fails. They're trying to reform, he said. The coordinator's trying to pull them back into the sphere, but the moment it gets 2,000 of them lined up, it sees the hull again, and the fear runs through all of them at once, and they scatter again. It can't hold them. Every time it looks at us, it loses its grip on its own fleet. It can't stop looking at us, Voss said. We're the thing that isn't supposed to exist. It's like a man who's just been told the ground he's standing on is water. He can't make himself believe it, and he can't make himself ignore it, and either way he's going down. Daniel watched the numbers and tried to make himself understand the scale of what he was seeing, and could not, because the human mind is not built for it. 18,996 lesser hulls, each one larger than any human city, each one carrying a piece of the same single mind, all of them now flying blind and frightened in a space that was suddenly too small for them. The catalogs had called them voices. He understood the word now. They had no thoughts of their own to lose. They were the lungs of a thing whose brain had just been told it could die, and they did what lungs do when the body panics, which was to seize and to gasp, and to work against each other. 2 more collisions, he reported. Captain, they're starting to fire. Not at us. At nothing. At each other. The drones nearest the edge are firing into the dark, because their last clean order was to defend the formation, and there's no formation left to tell them what defending means. He swallowed. It's not an army anymore. It's a stampede with weapons. That's what one mind in 19,000 bodies looks like the day it learns fear, Voss said quietly. It was never strong, Crew. It was just certain. The whole galaxy mistook the one for the other, for 10,000 years. We're the first ones to see the difference, because we're the first ones it couldn't make certain. She watched the knot of ships tighten. Remember this. Whatever you do with the rest of your life, certainty is not strength. It just looks like it, right up until something says no. The Velmar note was still singing. That was the strangest part. Even now, even as its swarm tangled and its certainty failed, The coordinator kept reaching for the only thing it had ever known how to do. The Neil song poured out across 40 bands, into the comms, into the lights, into the deck plating of Brightwater. But it was changed now. It had lost its patience and its kindness. It had become something closer to a plea. Lay down, it sang, to the moon that was unfolding beneath it. Lay down, you hear, you feel. The song is true. The song has always been true. Every voice joins the song. Lay down and the song will hold you, and you will be still, and it will not hurt. Why will you not lay down? Why have you never once laid down? It's begging, Okafor said. There was no triumph in her voice. She sounded almost sick. Captain, it's actually begging. It doesn't know how to threaten. It's never needed to. It's only ever had the one tool, and the tool stopped working, and now it's just asking. Over and over. I know, Voss said. Hold steady. It begged a lot of species before us. It just got a yes every time. She keyed the deep channel. Holt, the coordinator's losing the swarm. If you're going to do this, the windows now, while they're tangled and bunched. They've pulled most of the mass back toward the him. It's all in one place. I see it, Holt said. He did. On the gallery screens, the great chaotic knot of the choir armada had drawn in on itself, 19,000 frightened bodies crowding toward the one ship that had always told them what to do. The cathedral ship, the hymn, 112 kilometers of stained glass light now surrounded by its panicking children. The choir had spent 10,000 years learning to move as one. In its first moment of true fear, it could not stop being one, and so it bunched and crowded and made of itself a single target 1,000 kilometers wide. They've never had to scatter, Holt said softly, to no one. They don't know how. They came together to be safe, the way they always have. He looked at the spine readout, full and steady and waiting, and there's never been a thing in the galaxy big enough to punish them for it. He let one more second pass. He had earned it. Sir, Idris said. Holt thought about the people who had built this. The first of them, dead 60 years now, who had come down into the dark and started moving rock inward by the handful, knowing they would never see the end of it. Their children, who had grown up in tunnels and learned a trade with no name. Their grandchildren, the 3,000 who stood at the stations around him now. The first generation to be born into a finished weapon. The first to ever have the question put to them, would it ever be needed, and would they be ready when it was? He thought about the names on the inside of the crust, tens of thousands of them, now turned to face the stars. He thought about the year they had spent arguing over a single word. He thought about the long, quiet, faithful century of a people, doing the hardest thing a people can do, which is to prepare with all their strength for a day they pray will never come, and to do it anyway, and to keep doing it, generation after generation, when the easy thing, and the reasonable thing, and the thing every other species in the galaxy would have done, was to give up the pretense and either build the fleet openly or kneel. 103 years of patience. A promise kept so perfectly that the keeping of it had become a thing of legend that no one was allowed to know. All sections, Holt said, and his voice did not rise, because it did not need to. This is the Admiral. We kept the law, every word of it, for 103 years. We never built a warship. He looked out the great window, at the 19,400 hulls, crowded in fear above his ship. We're not going to start now. We're just going to finish a conversation they began. On Brightwater, Daniel Crew watched the line of light along the spine of the unfolded moon brighten past anything his board could measure. The readout simply gave up and showed a flat wall of white. Captain, he said, whatever's about to happen, it's about to happen. I know, Voss said. She put her hand on the back of his chair again, the way she had at the start, a long time ago, 20 whole minutes ago, when neither of them had known whether the thing under the moon would even wake. Watch this, Crew. You're one of 41 people who get to watch this from up here. Everyone else in the galaxy is going to spend the rest of their lives watching the recording and not believing it. You're going to have seen it. The Velmar note sang one last time, and the chord of 19,400 voices was no longer a chord at all. It had broken into pieces, into 19,000 separate frightened voices that had forgotten how to harmonize, and over all of them, The coordinator made one final sound, and it was not a command, and it was not a plea. It was a question, small and old, and genuinely lost. The question of a thing that had ruled the galaxy by certainty, and had just run out. "What are you?" asked the Velmar note. Down in the heart of the moon, Admiral Holt looked at the word that his crew had loaded into the spine a long time ago, the single word, 2 kilometers tall, that the great weapon would paint along its own hull in light as it fired. The answer the builders had chosen, 100 years before there was anyone to read it. "Show them," he said. The spine fired at 26 minutes past the hour, and for 1 full second, the Velmar system had 2 suns. Daniel Crew would try, for the rest of his life, to describe it, and he would never get it right, because there were no human words built for it. The line of light that ran the length of the unfolded moon, the 1,800-kilometer machine that had been a gray rock that morning, did not flash or flicker. It simply opened, all at once, into a beam of pure white force that reached up out of Harrow and across the dark, a column of light, 1,100 kilometers long, and so straight that it looked drawn rather than fired. A ruled line of annihilation laid across the sky. The beam did not aim. It did not need to. The choir had crowded itself into a single terrified mass, 1,000 kilometers across, 19,400 hulls pressed together around the one ship that had always kept them safe, and the spine of Harrow was wide enough and long enough to take all of it at once. It went through them like a hand through smoke. "Contacts," Daniel said, and his voice came out as a whisper, and then he made himself say it properly, because that was his job, because someone had to put the number on it. "Contacts dropping. Captain, they're dropping in the thousands." The beam swept the inner mass. I'm reading mass conversion. The lesser hulls aren't being hit. They're just gone. They're not debris. There's no debris. They're just not there anymore." "Counts," Voss said. Her voice was steady. Her face was not. "First pass." The beam held for 1.1 seconds. Daniel's hands shook over the board, and he steadied them. 11,200 lesser hulls gone in the first second. The voices, the drones, the 18,000 that just sing and shoot, more than half of them, 1 second. Down in the gallery, Admiral Holt watched the same number come up, and he did not smile, because there was nothing in this to smile at. There was only the work, and the long century that had led to it, and the fact that it was being done correctly. "Walk it," he said. "Slow. Don't rush." They came in close. "Let's make sure none of them leave thinking the song still works." The spine of Harrow began to move. Not the moon itself, but the beam, sweeping a fraction of a degree at a time, and as it swept, it painted the dark with light and erased the choir armada section by section. The 400 processionals, the 9-kilometer ships that carried the heavy projectors, the strong ones, turned at last to fight, and their fire fell on the hull of Harrow and did exactly nothing, because the hull of Harrow was the bones of a world, and the builders had armored it against the death of a sun. "The processionals are firing," Daniel reported, "all 400. Captain, they're hitting us. They're hitting the hull, full projector strikes, and the hull readout isn't changing. There's no damage. There's no heat. It's like throwing matches at a mountain." "That's because it is a mountain," Voss said. "Holt built a planet that shoots back. What did they think was going to happen?" Down in the gallery, Idris watched the projector strikes wash across the hull and read off the numbers in a voice that had gone strange with the size of them. "Sir, we are taking the full heavy fire of 400 choir processionals. Sustained. The strongest weapons the enemy has." A pause. "Hull integrity is at 100%. It hasn't moved. Not 1/10 of 1%. Sir, the sensors that read damage aren't even reporting, because they have nothing to report." "They built it to take worse than this," Holt said. "They built it to take the thing the choir doesn't have and never will. They built it to take time." He watched the beam sweep on. "Bring it across the processionals." The beam reached the processionals and took them the way it had taken the drones. 400 ships 9 kilometers long, the pride of the choir's heavy force, gone in under 3 seconds, swept off the board between one breath and the next. Daniel watched the count fall and fall and fall, and a part of him that was not the signal officer, that was just a young man, 26 years old, who had grown up on the stories of the Reach War, understood that he was watching the end of a thing that had ruled the galaxy by fear for 10,000 years, and that it was ending, not in a battle, but in a correction. The calm and total correction of a mistake. 8,000 remaining, he said. 6,000. Captain, they're trying to run now. The survivors. They're breaking away from the hymn. They're scattering for real this time. They're trying to get out of the beam's arc. How many are clear? Daniel ran the geometry. None, ma'am. The arc covers the whole sphere. There's nowhere inside the system they can get to before the beam reaches them. They crowded in too tight at the start. The place they ran to be safe is the place they can't get out of. It was the cruelest geometry he had ever calculated, and the choir had drawn it themselves. For 10,000 years, the swarm had survived by gathering close, by making of itself one great body that no single weapon could threaten, because no single weapon had ever existed that could threaten a 1,000-kilometer mass. The strategy had no flaw. It had simply never met the thing it was not built for, and the thing it was not built for was a weapon the size of a world, fired from inside the one rock they had decided was beneath their notice. Daniel kept reading the counts, because the counts were his job, and because saying the numbers out loud was the only thing keeping him inside his own body while the sky burned. 5,400 remaining. 4,900. They're crossing into the arc faster than they can clear it, ma'am. They keep flying into the beam, trying to get away from the beam. He watched a cluster of 200 hulls swing wide, find the edge of the light, and vanish into it on the same heading they had chosen to escape. They don't have a map of this. There's never been a thing they had to outrun. They're guessing, and every guess runs them back into it. Down in the gallery, Holt watched the same desperate arithmetic and felt no satisfaction in it, only the long, flat focus of a man finishing a task that has to be finished correctly. Hold the sweep steady, he said. Don't chase the strays. Let them come to it. A panicking enemy spends itself faster than you can spend it for them. Our only job is to be the wall they keep running into, and we are very good at being a wall. He glanced at the hull readout, still pinned at 100% under the full fire of the dying fleet. We were built to be a wall. We were built to be the last wall in the galaxy. Let them learn what that means. The Velmar note was still singing. That was the thing none of them would forget. Even now, even with 11,000 of its bodies gone and the rest dying, the coordinator kept the Neil song going, kept pouring it out across 40 bands into the comms and the lights and the deck plating of Brightwater, because it was the only thing it had ever known how to do, and it could not stop doing it, any more than a heart can decide to stop beating. But the song had changed past all recognition. It was no longer a chorus and no longer a plea. It was a single thin thread of sound, and what it carried now was not a command at all. What it carried was the simple animal terror of a mind that had never once in 10,000 years imagined its own end, and was watching that end arrive on schedule. It's trying the song on us still, Okafor said. She had stopped covering her ears a long time ago. There was nothing left in the song to defend against. It's dying, and it's still trying to make us kneel. It doesn't have anything else. Captain, it never had anything else. The whole time. The whole armada. It was one trick, and the trick stopped working, and there was never a second trick. No, Voss said quietly. There wasn't. That's why they banned us instead of fighting us. They knew there might not be a second trick, and they were right. She watched the count fall toward 4,000. Holt, the hymn. I see it, Holt said. The cathedral ship had not run. It could not. 112 kilometers of stained glass light, the heart of the choir, the throne of the coordinator. It was too vast to flee, and too central to abandon, and so it hung where it had always hung, at the middle of the dying swarm, while the beam walked toward it through the last of its children. Holt looked at it for a long moment on the gallery screen. He thought about painting the word now. The builders had loaded it for exactly this, the single word 2 kilometers tall that the spine would write in light along its own hull as it fired. The answer to the question the galaxy had been asking for 103 years. He had been saving it. He understood now what he had been saving it for. Not for the drones, not for the processionals, for this. He thought for a moment of the people who had chosen the word. The record said they had argued for a year. 41 proposals, the same number, by chance, as the crew now holding the line on Brightwater above him. Some had wanted a name, some had wanted a date, some had wanted the names of the dead of the Reach War, all of them, scrolled along the hull for as long as the beam burned. In the end, they had chosen the smallest thing, the plainest thing, the one word that needed no translation in any tongue, because the choir would feel its meaning, whether or not it could read the shape, the one word that was the whole of what humanity had been saying, quietly, patiently, for 103 years, to a galaxy that had not been listening. "Bring the beam to full," Holt said, "and paint the word. Let the last thing the hymn ever sees be the answer to its question." On Brightwater, Daniel Crew watched the spine of Harrow blaze brighter than it had yet blazed, and across the dark hull of the unfolded moon, in light that could be read from one end of the system to the other, 2 kilometers tall and 1,100 kilometers long, a single word burned into being, along the length of the largest weapon ever built. The word was number. That was all. One word, the oldest human answer, the word that had won the Reach War, and frightened the 9 powers, and bricked up the door the Neil song could never open. No, it blazed along the spine of the moon for 1 full second, long enough to be recorded, long enough to be remembered, long enough to be carried home. And then the beam took the hymn. The cathedral ship did not break apart. It was there, 112 kilometers of light and spires and slow stained glass tides, and then the beam reached it, and then it was not there, and there was no wreck and no debris and no last defiant flash, only the absence where the most feared ship in the galaxy had been. The Velmar Note's song cut off in the middle of a note. "The hymn is gone," Daniel said. He could barely hear his own voice. "Captain, the hymn is gone. The coordinator's signal is gone." The song stopped. The command deck of Brightwater was utterly silent. For the first time in 53 minutes, there was no song pressing against the hull, against the lights, against the teeth of every soul aboard. The silence was so complete that it had weight. People who had been holding themselves rigid for the better part of an hour felt the pressure go out of them all at once, and 1 or 2 had to sit down, and no one was ashamed of it. Okafor was the first to speak, and her voice cracked on the first word. "It's gone," she said. "The song. I can't feel it. I've had it in my teeth for an hour, and it's just gone." She looked around the deck, as if she did not quite trust the quiet. "Is that it? Is it actually over?" "For us? Here? Now?" "Almost," Voss said. She stopped beside a man named Petrov, who had wept through the whole engagement and worked through all of it, and she put her hand on his shoulder for a moment and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would be better than the hand. Then she went back to the rail. "Counts," she said softly. "Give me the last of it, Crew, and then we can all start trying to believe this." Daniel looked at his board, at the long, terrible column of numbers, and read the last of them. 19,399 hulls destroyed, he said, from a force of 19,400, in under 4 minutes. He stared at the screen. "1 contact remaining, ma'am. 1. It's at the far edge of the system, on the outbound line, running for the dark as hard as it can go. A coordinator form, a small one." "The Velmar Note," Voss said. "There's always a backup. A copy of the mind, kept apart, in case the main one falls." She watched the single fleeing dot on the screen, the one survivor out of 19,400. "Holt, there's one left. A coordinator. It's running. Do you want it?" There was a pause on the deep channel, a long one. "No," Holt said at last. "Let it run." "Sir?" "It's a messenger now," Holt said. "And we want the message delivered." His voice was very tired, and very old, and entirely certain. "Dead enemies tell no one anything. We didn't keep a promise for 103 years, so that the only witnesses would be us. Let it carry the word home. Let it tell them what it saw. That's worth more than one more kill." On the screen, the last hull of the choir fled into the dark, alone, the lone survivor of an armada, carrying inside it the memory of a moon that had taken off its face and said no, and behind it, where 19,400 ships had hung an hour before, there was nothing at all but slowly cooling dust. "Stand the beam down," Holt said quietly into the gallery. "Seal the crust. Put the face back on." And in the deep parts of the moon, 3,000 people who had just used the thing their grandparents had built began very slowly, to understand that it had worked, and that they were still alive, and that the long wait was over, and most of them wept, and all of them kept working, because the work was the only thing large enough to hold what they were feeling. The dust took a long time to cool, and the Velmar note watched it go from the far edge of the system, alone, running, carrying everything it had just learned in the only mind the choir had left. It was the backup. There was always a backup, a copy of the coordinator kept apart and quiet at the rear of every armada, in case the worst should happen. The worst had never happened in 10,000 years. The backup had been carried system to system for 100 generations, and never once been needed. A habit so old its purpose had become a ritual no one questioned. Now it was the whole of the choir. 19,400 bodies, and the great cathedral mind that had ruled them had been reduced, in under 4 minutes, to a single fleeing form, no larger than a customs cutter, which was, when the Velmar note finally understood it, the cruelest part of the whole morning. The galaxy had banned humanity from building anything larger than a customs cutter, and a thing the size of a customs cutter was all the choir had left. It did not sing as it ran. There was no one left to sing to. For the first time in its long existence, the Velmar note was not part of a chorus. It was one voice, alone, the very thing the Neil song had been built to make impossible, and the silence inside it was so total that it had no name in any of the 10,000 languages the choir had folded over the ages. It tried, once, to understand what had happened, the way a mind picks at a wound it cannot leave alone. It went back over the morning. It had arrived certain of victory, as it had always been certain, because the song had never failed. It had found a small human station and a dead gray moon, and it had begun to sing, and the humans had not knelt, and that alone should have been impossible. And then the moon had opened, and the moon had been a weapon, and the weapon had been the size of a world, and the world had said no, 2 kilometers tall, in light, and then there had been no more choir. The Velmar note turned the sequence over and over, and could find no point at which it could have done anything differently, because the trap had not been laid in the 4 minutes of the battle. The trap had been laid 103 years ago, by a species that had agreed to be disarmed, and had then spent a century quietly turning the agreement into the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. It carried a message, though no one had given it one. The message was simply what it had seen. It would carry that message back along the long road to the worlds of the choir, and it would take the slow way, because the fast lanes ran past the systems of the 9 powers, and the Velmar note did not want to be seen, and it could not have explained why even to itself, except that the seeing had changed. It would carry, too, a thing it could not have named but could not stop turning over, which was the question of how a species kneels to a song for the sake of 100 years, and is still, at the end of it, standing. The choir had taken that to be weakness, when it first found the humans bound by treaty, disarmed, obedient, a young loud people made to sit quietly at the edge of the map. It had read their obedience as the first soft note of surrender, the kneel beginning early, and it had come to the Velmar system, expecting only to finish a thing already mostly done. It understood now, too late to matter, that it had read the note backward. The humans had not been kneeling, they had been waiting. And the difference between those two things, which the choir had spent its whole existence unable to tell apart, was the difference between a folded species and a moon that opens. Behind it, on Brightwater, the crew of 41 sat in the new silence, and did not quite believe they were alive. "Stand down from alert," Captain Mara Voss said at last, and her voice in the quiet sounded strange to all of them, because for an hour they had only heard voices over the song, and now there was no song to talk over. Slowly, nobody do anything sudden. "We just watched a moon stand up. Let's all take a minute." Daniel Crew looked at his board, at the long empty space where 19,400 contacts had been, at the single dot fleeing toward the dark. He was 26 years old. He had been awake for 20 hours. He found that his hands had finally stopped shaking, not because he was calm, but because there was nothing left to be afraid of, and the body does not know what to do with that, so it simply goes still. "Captain," he said, "what happens now?" "Now?" Voss came and stood beside him, and looked at the screen with him. "Now the galaxy finds out." She keyed the station-wide channel one more time, the same channel she had used at the start to tell them not to kneel, and her voice went out to every deck and corridor of Brightwater, to all 41 of them, the same 41 who had held the line in their own heads for 53 minutes. All hands, this is the captain. The choir armada is destroyed. We are intact. There are no casualties. I want every one of you to hear me say that, because in an hour, you are not going to believe it happened, and I want it on the record before the doubting starts. She paused, and when she went on, her voice was quieter and more her own. You did the hardest thing there is. You sat in your chairs on a relay station with one ice cutter, and the most feared power in the galaxy sang at you to stop, and you did not stop. You didn't have a weapon, you had a no. That was the whole of your armor, and it was enough, and it was always going to be enough. Because that is the one thing we were never disarmed of, and the one thing they were never able to take. A breath. Stand down from alert. Half watch, get some rest. And the next time someone tells you that a small thing can't stand against a large one, you remember today. You remember that you were the small thing, and the large thing blinked first. The channel clicked off, and for a moment, no one on the deck moved, and then, somewhere aft, someone began, very quietly, to laugh. The helpless shaking laugh of a person who has just understood they get to keep their life, and it spread along the deck the way the song had spread an hour before. Except that this was the opposite of the song. This was the sound of people who had decided something and been proven right. She was right that the galaxy would find out, though it would take time. The Velmar system was at the dark edge of the map, and even light needs hours to cross it, and the recording of what had happened above Harrow had a long way to travel before it reached the worlds that needed to see it. But it would reach them. Brightwater's whole purpose was to pass messages along, and Voss had no intention of stopping now. The recording went out on every band, unencrypted, plain, to all 9 powers at once, the way you deliver news you want no one to be able to pretend they never received. It showed everything. It showed the choir arriving, 19,400 hulls in a tidy sphere, the most feared armada in the galaxy, certain of an easy harvest. It showed the Neil song pouring out and finding nothing to grip. It showed the gray moon Harrow, the dead slag rock that 9 inspections had signed off on, splitting along seams machined 100 years before, peeling its crust back like the petals of a flower, revealing that the whole world was a weapon. It showed the names, tens of thousands of them, written along the hull where only the dark had been meant to read them. It showed the spine firing, 1,100 kilometers of light. It showed the word 2 kilometers tall burning along the hull. It showed 19,399 ships becoming dust in under 4 minutes, and 1 ship running for the dark, allowed to run. And it showed, at the end, the moon settling back into its slow orbit, its crust folding closed again over the hull, the seams sealing, the light going out, until what hung above Brightwater was once more a gray, cratered, unremarkable moon named Harrow, a dead lump of rock too poor to mine and too dull to study. That was the part that frightened the 9 powers most, not the beam, not the 4 minutes, the fact that when it was over, the weapon put its face back on and went back to being a moon, and there was no way, from outside, to tell that anything had changed at all. Because that was the truth of it, the truth that traveled out across the galaxy in the days and weeks that followed, and could not be unlearned. Humanity had kept the promise. That was what no one could get past. Humanity had not cheated. The treaty had said no warship larger than a customs cutter, and humanity had built no warship at all, not one, not ever, in 103 years. The inspectors had come 9 times and found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Because a moon is not a warship, the treaty itself said so, in language 1,000 pages long, that 9 powers had written and signed and trusted. Humanity had obeyed every word of the law. It had simply obeyed it so perfectly, so patiently, so completely, that the obedience had become the most frightening thing in the galaxy. In the great halls of the 9 powers, when the recording arrived, there was no talk of war. That was the strangest part, and the one the choir's lone survivor would never understand, because the choir had only ever understood force. The 9 powers did not understand force. They understood time, and patience, and the keeping of promises, because they were old, and they had thought, until that day, that they were the oldest and most patient things in the galaxy. They had banned humanity from building a fleet, because they were afraid of what humanity would build. And they had received, in answer, the proof that humanity had spent a century building exactly nothing they had forbidden, and had still, somehow, ended up with a weapon that could erase 19,400 ships in under 4 minutes, and then pretend to be a rock. There was nothing in the treaty against it. They had checked. They checked for a long time. Their lawyers, who had drafted 1,000 pages to be certain humanity could never build a fleet, read those 1,000 pages again and again, looking for the line that humanity had broken. And there was no line, because humanity had not broken one. The treaty forbade the building of warships. It said nothing of moons. It had never occurred to the 9 powers that it needed to, because it had never occurred to them that anyone would be patient enough to spend 100 years turning a moon into one. They had measured humanity by their own patience, and found it wanting, and that had been their single, total mistake. And there was nothing they could do about it, because the moon was still there, gray and quiet and dead, and they did not dare go and look too closely, because they already knew what they would find, and they already knew it would look back. Some among the 9 counseled a new treaty, a clause to cover moons, a clause to cover planets, a clause to cover any body of any kind that a species might hollow into a weapon. They drafted it. They never sent it, because to send it would be to admit, in writing, before the whole galaxy, what humanity had done and how completely it had been allowed to do it, and because, when they sat with the drafting, every one of them came at last to the same cold thought, which was that a people patient enough to wait 100 years inside a moon would simply find the next hole in the next 1,000 pages, and wait again, and the only thing a new treaty would teach them was where to dig. So they filed nothing, they said nothing, they let the moon be a moon, and they were quiet around the name of humanity in a way they had never been quiet before, and that silence was the only verdict the matter ever received. There were other moons, of course. That thought arrived in the great halls a few days after the recording, and once it arrived it could not be made to leave. Humanity held many systems. Humanity had been disarmed in all of them, and every one of those systems had moons, dead gray bodies logged as slag, anchors and ballast and nothing more, scanned once and dismissed and never looked at again. The 9 powers had spent a century certain that they had taken humanity's teeth. Now they sat in their old halls and counted the moons in the human sky, and understood that they had no way, none, to know which of those gray rocks were rocks and which were patient, and that they would never have a way, because the one thing they had proven beyond doubt was that humanity could hide a fleet inside a world and keep it hidden through 9 inspections and 100 years. Perhaps Harrow was the only one. Perhaps it was not. The not knowing was the whole of the new piece, and it belonged entirely to the humans, and it had cost them nothing but patience, which was the one currency the 9 powers had always believed only they possessed. A delegation came, once, in the months that followed, not a fleet, a single unarmed ship from the eldest of the 9 powers, carrying envoys who had helped write the treaty 103 years before, and who were old enough, barely, to remember signing it. They did not ask to inspect Harrow. They did not mention Harrow at all. They came to Brightwater, and they spoke with Captain Mara Voss in the station's small wardroom, and the records of that conversation were sealed, but one line of it escaped into the long memory of the relay crews, and was repeated ever after. The eldest envoy, a creature of vast age and great courtesy, had looked at the gray moon through the wardroom port for a long while, and had said at last, "We thought we understood you. We thought patience was a thing the young could not do." And Voss had answered, "We're not young, you just never let us get old enough for you to notice." The story of the gray moon did not stay in the great halls. It went down, the way the dangerous stories always go down, into the trade lanes and the dock bars, and the small crowded ships of 100 lesser species, who had spent their whole histories being told what they were, and were not allowed to be. They had no moon of their own, most of them. They had no warship, and no hidden century, and no admiral asleep under a crust of rock. But they had the recording, and they watched it, and they watched the word 2 kilometers tall burn along the spine of a thing that had been a dead rock that morning, and a number of them came away from it carrying a small new idea that no treaty had thought to forbid, which was simply that a settled fact was only settled until someone with enough patience decided otherwise. The 9 powers never learned to fear that idea, because they never saw it spread, because it spread in the quiet places they had stopped listening to a long time ago. But it spread. A word, once it is 2 kilometers tall and written in light, does not unwrite itself. It only waits, the way the moon waited, for the next people patient enough to mean it. Down in the deep gallery of Harrow, Admiral Holt watched the last of the dust drift apart on the gallery screen, and then he watched the crust of his ship fold closed over the hull, sealing the great weapon back inside its disguise, putting the moon's face back on. 3,000 people moved quietly at their stations around him, the first generation born into a finished weapon, the first to ever use it. Most of them were weeping, quietly, and working, and Holt understood both halves of that, because he was doing the same. "Sir," Idris said, "spine is powering down. All sections green. The crust is sealed. We read as a moon again." A pause. "We did it. After 100 years, we actually did it. And it worked. And it worked the first time." "It worked the first time," Holt agreed, "because the people who built it knew there would never be a second time." He looked at the great window, now filled with rock again, the stars sealed away behind 100 kilometers of crust. They gave their whole lives to a thing they prayed would never be needed. The best of them died hoping they had wasted their time. He was quiet for a moment. "We didn't waste it. I find I'm sorry about that. They'd have been glad to." He walked the length of the gallery one more time, past the stations and the weeping crews and the screens going dark, and he stopped at the place where the names began, the first of the tens of thousands carved into the inner skin of the moon, and he read a few of them, the way a man reads the names on an old memorial, slowly, without hurry, giving each one its moment. He had known some of them, most he had not. All of them had spent their lives on this, in the dark, on faith, and now the thing they had built had spoken once, in one word, and would, with any luck, never need to speak again. He stood there a while longer than the work required, because the work could wait, and the names had waited 100 years for someone to read them under an open sky, and he was the only one left who could do it for them, and so he did, name after name, until the reading was done. He keyed the channel to Brightwater one last time. "Voss. Holt. Go back to passing messages," he said. "Log the moon as quiet. We're going back to sleep." A pause, and something almost like warmth came into the old voice. "Take care of your 41. They saw something today. They'll need each other." "I know," Voss said. "Holt, thank you." "Don't thank me," Holt said. "Thank the people in the dark. I just woke up and pushed the button they spent 100 years building." The channel clicked and was quiet, and the Admiral went back into the deep parts of the moon, into the dark where the weapon waited, to sleep again, perhaps for another 100 years, perhaps forever, which was the only ending any of them had ever truly wanted. On Brightwater, Daniel Crew watched the gray moon hang below the station, dead and quiet and unremarkable, and he found that he could not look at it the same way ever again, and he knew that no one who had seen the recording ever would. It was the most dangerous object in the galaxy, and it looked like nothing at all, and that was the point. That had always been the point. He would serve out his years on the station, and he would grow old, and he would tell the story, on the nights when he could be made to tell it, and the people he told it to would not quite believe him, and he would understand, because he had been there, and he barely believed it himself. Far out, on the dark edge of the map, the Velmar note ran for home, alone, the last voice of a silenced choir, carrying a message the 9 powers could never file away, and could never answer, and could never forget. It took the long way, the slow way, the way that ran past nothing, and was seen by no one, because it had learned, in 4 minutes above a gray moon, the one thing the Neil song had never been able to teach anyone, which was fear. It would reach the worlds of the choir eventually, and it would tell them what it had seen, and they would not believe it, the way the 9 powers had not believed it, the way no one ever believed it until they saw the recording of a moon taking off its face. And the message it carried, when at last it could be put into words, was very short, and very old, and very simple, and it was this. They told the humans they could not build a fleet. The humans said nothing. They waited 100 years. They kept every word of the law. And then, when the galaxy came to teach them to kneel, they took off the face of a moon, wrote one word across the sky, and declined. The dust that had been the most feared armada in the galaxy drifted apart in the dark above Harrow, and cooled, and was gone. And the moon went back to sleep, and waited. The way it had always waited. The way it would always wait. Patient as the people who had built it, keeping the promise so perfectly that the keeping of it had become the only thing in all the galaxy that anyone was truly afraid of. The galaxy had banned a fleet, so humanity built a moon and called it a moon and meant it. Right up until the morning it stood and said no.